What is a learning target? How do I write a learning target? What's the difference between a learning target and an objective? How can I describe to my students' parents how I use learning targets in my classroom with their children? Could I describe to my administrator how I use learning targets to guide my daily instruction? In this presentation, Learning Targets, the 9 Action Points, OHS teachers present information they have learned from Berger, Rugen, and Woodfin's book, Leaders of Their Own Learning, published in 2014. Learning targets are goals for lessons, projects, units, and courses. They derive from standards and are used to assess growth and achievement. They are written in concrete, student-friendly language, beginning with the stem I can, and then shared with students, posted in the classroom, and tracked carefully by students and teachers during the process of teaching. The 9 action points of learning targets help convey what's called the learning target theory of action, which embodies the relationship between 3 things: essential content, effective instruction, and meaningful learning. The first action point is learning targets are the first principle of meaningful learning and effective teaching. Teachers and students love summer break. Sometimes we travel across the state, and sometimes we travel across the country. But whenever we travel, we always know where we're going, and we know how we're going to get there. We use maps or navigational tools to do so. So the first step in closing the achievement gap using learning targets, getting students to be leaders of their own learning, is to define the learning target. It's the driving force. A learning target must be specific, challenging, and appropriate. It has to guide everything the teacher does, and the outcome is that students will begin to self-assess and internalize standards, assuming greater responsibility for their own learning. When students assume greater responsibility, they develop pride, and with that pride eventually comes success. And with success, students will begin to have greater motivation. And we want our classrooms to be filled with students who have strong intrinsic motivation. Action point 2 states, today's lesson should serve a purpose in a longer learning trajectory towards some larger learning goal. I love this quote from Leaders of Their Own Learning. If neither half of the learning team, students nor teachers, knows where the learning is headed, then neither one can make informed decision about how to get there. So a learning target is good for one lesson, not a week, not 2 weeks or longer. And it depends on logical and sequential planning based on long and short-term goals that the teacher has decided. Learning targets also depend on what the students already know, and it doesn't ask students to do more of the same. Action point 3. It's not a learning target unless both the teacher and the students aim for it in today's lesson. Teachers and students ought to be teams in the classroom. When teachers and students are not a team, then teachers expect compliance. And that's really at the root of what learning objectives are. A teacher does not want compliance to their plan of attack, but instead wants a shared plan of attack, where a student and teacher both understand it and aim for it. Where there is no learning target, teachers and students' energies go completely different directions. But where targets are carefully crafted and understood and aimed for by both the teacher and the student, then partnerships are created in the classroom. Action point 4 states, every lesson needs a performance of understanding to make the target for today's lesson crystal clear. And Berger, Rugen, and Woodfin's book compares this to Cinderella's slipper. Like Cinderella's slipper, the performance of understanding asks students to try on the target during a meaningful learning experience that produces strong evidence of student learning while students are learning. The place to start for teachers then is, how do I know what students know? The result should be some performance, some action that students can do that would demonstrate what the student knows. So, performances of understanding provide teachers up to the minute, right now evidence of where students are in relation to the learning target. And if an observer were to come in the classroom, it could be observed in one of 3 different ways, and hopefully all 3. First, the observer could notice evidence of learning taking place in the classroom. At Oxford High School, we look a lot at fine-grained evidence as opposed to large grain evidence. We look at what the teacher is saying, what the teacher is doing, and what students are saying and doing. Also, the observer could talk to students about learning and ask, "What are you learning today?" And hopefully, the answer students give is not a task, but rather some learning target. Thirdly, an observer could talk to teachers about invested intentions and actual outcomes, what the students are learning, how the teacher knows certain students are learning, and how the teacher knows certain students are struggling. Action point 5 states, expert teachers partner with their students during a formative learning cycle to make teaching and learning visible and to maximize opportunities to feed students forward. It is inclusive of a 5-part cycle. Number 1, to model and explain the learning target. Number 2, for the teacher to provide guided practice. Number 3, for there to be a performance and an act that demonstrates understanding. Number 4, that formative feedback would be provided. And then finally, that the students would have another opportunity to improve their performance. During this cycle, questions teachers and students could answer are, where am I going? Where am I now? How can I close the gap between where I am now and where I want to go? Action point 6. Setting and committing to specific, appropriate, and challenging goals lead to increased achievement and motivation to learn. This quote, I thought also, is very good from leaders of their own learning. Feeding students forward helps them consistently succeed, recognize their success, and attribute that success to what they do. So, in this, we actually look at 2 types of goals, short-term, called proximal goals, and long-term, called distal goals. Increased achievement correlates with commitment to both of these types of goal setting. Learning targets are essentially the proximal goals, these lesson-size goals that lead up to the long-term or distal goal. Proximal goals are powerful incentives, and they positively affect student achievement regardless of who sets them. It's nice to know that you are at a mile marker on the path to ultimate success. Action point 7. Intentionally developing assessment-capable students is a crucial step toward closing the achievement gap. And so, assessment-capable students, this is important for teachers to ensure students are able to assess themselves. Teachers have to teach this, that is, self-assessment, metacognition, and decision-making. And during the process of teaching them these skills, the teacher needs to provide ample feedback and give students ownership. As students get ownership of their learning, their personal and academic growth, they become active partners in learning, demonstrate resilience, develop a can-do attitude, and can set more challenging targets. Students will begin to learn to like challenges as they successfully accomplish learning targets along the way to reaching a distal goal. Learning a deliberate pursuit of increased knowledge and skills that require successful learning strategies. In this, teachers are seen as experts. They are not necessarily experienced. As experts, they make decisions to increase achievement and motivation. So they keep the students on course for ultimately reaching both short and long-term goals. Action point 8 states, what students are actually doing during today's lesson is both the source of and the yardstick for school improvement efforts. Notice this quote from the text. What's happening in today's lesson makes or breaks our chances for raising student achievement in significant and meaningful ways. What students do in the classroom should advance and engage school improvement efforts. Just as a student's life is lived one day at a time, one moment at a time, school achievement, academic achievement, and even students' lives are lived one lesson at a time. If summative assessments are macro level, then what students are actually doing right now is like using a close-up lens. Data pinpoints what works and what doesn't. So classroom evidence is what informs our teachers' decisions about developing them and administrators and schools. Finally, action point 9 states, Improving the teaching learning process requires everyone in the school, teachers, students, and administrators, to have specific learning targets and look-fors. So, educators, we need to know what we're looking for. We do not describe what we see during a classroom observation. Rather, we see what we can describe. Let's get to where we can know what to look for. Characteristics or performances of understanding, learning targets, and even what could be tangibly referred to as engaged learning. There are no neutral educational practices. We are either moving students forward or we are allowing them to regress. So, best practices look-fors promote action, allowing students, teachers, principals, central office administrators, all stakeholders to know where they are headed and plan ways to close the achievement gap. Thanks for checking out this presentation. Good luck on your use of learning targets in the classroom.